At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law told me to sell our home. She called it his final wish just hours after we buried him. I clutched his photograph and said nothing. Little did she know his real final wish was a secret just for me, one that she would never see coming. Follow my story to the end, like and share, and tell me what city you are listening from. The silence in the house was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It had been 3 days since Arthur passed, but the quiet that followed his absence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered every room. This house, our house, had always been filled with life. It was filled with the echoes of our laughter, the scent of the roses Arthur grew in the garden, and the comfortable rhythm of two people who had built a world together from the ground up. We laid the first brick ourselves, a crooked, clumsy attempt that we'd always pointed to with pride. Every floorboard held a memory. Every window framed a season of our shared life. Now it just felt empty, a beautiful shell whose pearl was gone. I walked through the living room, my fingers trailing over the worn leather of his favorite armchair. I could almost see him there, glasses perched on his nose, lost in a history book. The grief was a constant, unwelcome guest, sitting beside me at the dinner table and lying next to me in our cold, empty bed. My relationship with my son, Daniel, and his wife, Victoria, had been strained for years. Daniel was a good boy, but he had always been easily swayed, and Victoria's influence over him was absolute. She was a woman carved from ice, with sharp edges and a gaze that appraised everything and everyone for their value. She saw our home not as a sanctuary of memories, but as a prime piece of real estate. On their visits, she would walk through the rooms with a critical eye, making comments about outdated fixtures or suggesting renovations that would improve its market price. Daniel would just stand by, shifting his weight uncomfortably, never once defending the home he grew up in or the parents who built it. I tried not to let it bother me, telling myself that it was just her way, but it always left a bitter taste in my mouth. The day of Arthur's funeral was a blur of black suits, hushed condolences, and well-meaning but empty words. People told me he was in a better place, that he was at peace, but his place was here with me in the garden he loved. I stood by the graveside, the damp earth smelling of finality, and felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if I were watching a scene from someone else's life. Victoria stood close, her hand on Daniel's arm, her expression a perfect mask of sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes. She managed the affair with chilling efficiency, directing guests and accepting sympathies as if she were hosting a business luncheon. I felt small and fragile, a ghost at my own husband's farewell. Later that day, back at the house, the last of the guests had finally departed, leaving behind plates of uneaten sandwiches and a lingering scent of lilies. I sank into Arthur's armchair, the exhaustion so deep it felt like it had settled in my bones. I just wanted to be alone with my memories, to let the tears I had been holding back finally fall. But it was not to be. Victoria approached me, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Daniel hovered behind her, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "Eleanor," Victoria began, her tone gentle but firm, the kind of tone one uses to deliver difficult but necessary news. "We need to talk about the house." I stared at her, uncomprehending. The air was still thick with the grief of the day, the scent of funeral flowers heavy in every room. This was not the time for practicalities. "What about the house?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Victoria took a breath, steeling herself. "Arthur and I discussed this," she said, and the lie was so audacious it almost took my breath away. "He was worried about you being here all alone, the upkeep, the expense. He didn't want you to be burdened." She paused, letting the words sink in. "His final wish was for you to sell the place, Eleanor. He wanted you to move into a smaller apartment, something more manageable. It's what's best." The words hit me like stones. My Arthur, who loved every inch of this home, who spent his weekends tending to the garden and fixing the leaky faucet he always complained about with a smile, would never wish for this. This house wasn't a burden. It was our life's work. It was the only piece of him I had left. I looked past Victoria to my son, my eyes pleading with him to say something, to deny this cruel fiction. But Daniel remained silent. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes finally meeting mine for a fleeting second before darting away. In that moment, his silence was a deeper betrayal than her words. I felt the last bit of warmth in the room vanish, leaving me utterly alone, surrounded by the cold ambition of my daughter-in-law and the crushing disappointment of my son's cowardice. The battle for my home and for my husband's memory had just begun. Sitting in the deafening silence of my home, Victoria's cruel words echoed, not just from moments ago, but from across 15 years of carefully orchestrated cruelty. When Daniel first brought her home, she was a vision of charm and grace. She complimented my home, praised my cooking, and listened to Arthur's stories with rapt attention. We were so happy for our son. The first crack in her perfect facade appeared during their engagement party planning. My suggestion for the caterer we had used for years was met with a sweet smile and a dismissive, "Oh, that's a lovely thought, Eleanor, but we want something a bit more modern." It was subtle, but it was the beginning. By their wedding, I was no longer a participant, but a spectator. Every tradition I cherished, every small contribution I offered, was quietly vetoed. I was relegated to a guest in a pretty dress, watching my son marry a woman who was systematically erasing me from the picture. The manipulation escalated after they bought their first house, a beautiful colonial in a prestigious neighborhood. Arthur and I gave them $200,000 for the down payment, a significant portion of our savings, believing we were investing in our family's future. In the beginning, there were Sunday dinners, but they soon became sporadic. The excuses were always plausible. Daniel had to work late, the children were tired, Victoria wasn't feeling well. Then came the birth of our first grandchild, Sophie. The joy I felt was quickly tempered by a new kind of pain. I was systematically excluded from the small, precious moments. I would hear about her first steps or her first words weeks after the fact. Victoria would feign surprise. "Oh, didn't you get our message? We must have called the wrong number." But there were never any missed calls, never any messages. When our grandson Leo was born a few years later, the exclusion was no longer subtle. It was a closed door. I wasn't invited to his first birthday party, or his second. Arthur, ever my protector, would try to intervene. He would call Daniel, his voice calm but firm, asking why his mother wasn't being included. Daniel's responses were always a jumble of anxious excuses, the words sounding rehearsed. "It's just, Victoria gets stressed with too many people around, Dad. It's not personal." But it was deeply personal. Arthur saw it for what it was, a classic strategy of isolation. Victoria was severing Daniel's ties to his past, making him completely dependent on her. The breaking point for my heart came on Sophie's 8th birthday. I had bought her a beautiful handcrafted dollhouse, a replica of the one I had as a child. I called Daniel, excited to arrange a time to give it to her. His voice on the other end was strained. "Mom, about the party, Victoria thinks it's better if it's just close family this year." The phrase hung in the air between us. I wasn't close family. The final blow came when he stammered. She says you make the kids uncomfortable with all your old-fashioned ideas." I could barely breathe. My ideas? The idea that grandparents should be a part of a child's life? That family means more than a picture-perfect image? That was when Arthur's quiet sadness turned into cold resolve. He saw the campaign of alienation for the poison it was. While I cried, he began to document. He kept a small, unassuming journal. In it, he meticulously recorded every ignored phone call, every declined invitation, every flimsy excuse. He printed out the glossy, happy family photos Victoria would post on social media, pictures of holidays and birthdays I was never invited to, each one a polished public lie that hid a cruel reality. The final straw for him was his own 70th birthday. We had a small gathering in our garden. Victoria and Daniel arrived late and left early. She barely spoke to Arthur, spending most of the time on her phone and making a dismissive comment about the state of our aging rose bushes. I saw a look in my husband's eyes that day, a deep, settled determination. Now, as Victoria's demand to sell this house, our sanctuary, ricocheted through my grief, I understood. Her cruelty wasn't random, it was a long, calculated game. But what she never knew was that my quiet, gentle Arthur was a player too. He had been planning his own final move, a meticulous and just response to years of her heartless strategy, and I was the one who was about to put his plan into motion. The mahogany-paneled office of Mr. Davies felt cold and imposing. Daniel and Victoria sat opposite me, a heavy polished desk separating us. Victoria wore an expression of impatient solemnity, as if this were a tedious but necessary formality before she could get her hands on the house. Daniel just looked tired, a man caught in a current too strong for him. I clutched my handbag, my knuckles white, feeling Arthur's presence beside me. A silent, steadying force. Davies, a kind man with weary eyes who had been our family lawyer for 30 years, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. After dispensing with the initial bequests, he paused, picking up a separate, sealed document. And now, he said, his voice dropping slightly, we come to a codicil Arthur added to his will 6 months ago. It specifically addresses the final disposition of the primary residence and is contingent upon the conduct of certain beneficiaries. Victoria shifted in her chair, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Daniel looked at me, a question in his eyes. Mr. Davies continued, Arthur felt it was important to provide context for his decisions. He left behind evidence to ensure his final wishes were understood and respected. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder, placing it in the center of the desk. For the last 2 years of his life, Arthur had a voice-activated recording system installed in his home office. He was concerned about conversations and pressures he felt were being unfairly applied. A deep, chilling silence fell over the room. Victoria's face went rigid, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. He what? She whispered, her voice sharp with disbelief. Mr. Davies ignored her, pressing a button on the device. And then her own voice filled the quiet office, as clear and cutting as if she were standing right there. I don't know why we have to keep doing this, Daniel. Your mother is becoming more pathetic by the day, calling about the children. Sophie told me the other day that her house smells like old people. She says her grandmother's stories are boring. I closed my eyes, the familiar sting of those words, now made public, still wounding me. The recording continued, a monologue of casual cruelty. Frankly, she had her time. It's time for her to step back and let the real family take over. God knows she didn't do you any favors. If she'd raised you with more of a backbone, you'd be able to stand up to her yourself instead of making me the bad guy all the time. Daniel sank lower in his chair, the color draining from his face. He looked utterly broken, exposed by his wife's contempt and his father's ghost. Victoria shot to her feet. Turn that off. This is illegal. You can't record someone without their permission. She stammered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. Mr. Davies looked at her over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. On the contrary, Mrs. Peterson, he stated calmly, in this state, the law only requires one party to the conversation to consent to the recording. As Arthur was present for and a party to all of these conversations in his own home, they are perfectly legal. Please sit down. Defeated, she slowly sank back into her chair. Mr. Davies let the silence hang for a moment before pressing another button. Again, Victoria's voice, this time laced with smug satisfaction. I handled the school situation with Sophie's teacher. I told her that Grandma Eleanor lives quite far away and has some recurring health problems, so she isn't able to be very involved. It's just easier that way. It manages the situation and stops Sophie from getting confusing ideas from her old-fashioned nonsense about mandatory Sunday dinners and respecting elders. She laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of any humor. Honestly, who has time for that anymore? The lie was breathtaking in its simplicity, in its cruelty. He hadn't just been erasing me from their private lives. She was methodically erasing my very existence from my grandchildren's world. The pain was so sharp, it felt like a physical blow. Mr. Davies switched off the device, the sudden silence jarring. He looked directly at Victoria, whose face was now a pale, chalky mask. That was recording number 2, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Arthur left a total of 19. The number 19 hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed with a deep, furious red. She leaped to her feet, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. This is outrageous. This is a violation. Arthur was a sick, manipulative old man, and you are all letting him defame me from the grave. Her voice was shrill, the carefully cultivated polish cracking under the pressure. Mr. Davies simply held up a hand, a silent command for her to stop, and press play on the recorder once more. This time, the audio quality was slightly different, fainter, as if capturing a phone call. It was still unmistakably Victoria, but her tone was relaxed, conspiratorial, laced with a casual cruelty that was far more chilling than her anger. She was talking to a friend. "Honestly, the old man is finally starting to decline," she said, and I could hear the clink of a glass in the background. "His memory's getting fuzzy. I give him maybe 2 years, tops. It's a bit of a waiting game, but it will be worth it." The friend's muffled response was inaudible, but Victoria's next words were crystal clear. She laughed, a low, self-satisfied chuckle. "Oh, Daniel will be fine. By the time his father finally goes, Daniel will be so dependent on my version of reality that he won't even question it. He'll believe whatever I tell him." There was another pause, then the final devastating blow. "And her? Eleanor?" Victoria's voice dripped with contempt. "She'll be completely isolated by then. We'll have the house, the money, and the kids will barely remember who she is. She'll just be this sad old woman that everyone feels sorry for, visiting once a year out of pity. It's perfect, really." The recording clicked off, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. It was heavier and more profound than any sound. It was the sound of a life being irrevocably shattered. I didn't look at Victoria. I looked at my son. He sat frozen, his head slowly turning toward his wife as if moving through water. His face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. 2 large tears welled up in his eyes and traced slow, silent paths down his cheeks. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper, a child's plea. "Victoria, is this really how you feel? How you see my parents? Me?" It was the final question, the last thread of hope he was clinging to. And in that moment, she snapped it. Trapped, exposed, with nowhere left to hide, Victoria let the mask of the charming, sophisticated wife fall away completely. It didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the ugly, venomous creature that had been hiding beneath it all along. She turned her furious gaze on me, her eyes narrowed into slits. "Fine," she snarled, the words sharp and violent. "Yes, I think you're a pathetic, clinging old woman who can't accept that your time is over. This family is mine now. It was never yours to keep." She wasn't finished. She took a step toward me, her body trembling with rage. "And yes," she spat, her voice rising with each word, her contempt a tangible force in the room. "I have been counting the days until Arthur died so we could finally sell this dusty mausoleum and live our lives without having to pretend we care about your boring stories and your sentimental junk." The final confession was so monstrous, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Before she could say another word, there was a loud crash. Daniel had shot up from his chair so fast that it toppled over backward, hitting the floor with a sharp crack. He stood there, swaying slightly, his hands covering his mouth as he stared at the woman he had married, the mother of his children, as if seeing her for the very first time. Mr. Davies watched, his face grim, but I remained perfectly still. A strange, sorrowful calm washed over me. There was no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness. But through the pain, I felt a flicker of peace. Arthur's plan had worked. Everyone in the room, especially my son, could finally see the real Victoria. The mask had not just shattered, it had been pulverized, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath. But my husband's justice was just beginning to unfold. Keep listening to see the meticulous plan he set in motion from beyond the grave. If this story has touched you, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Daniel stared at Victoria, his face a canvas of dawning horror and profound betrayal. "Do you realize what you just admitted to?" he asked, his voice raw and shaking. "My father is gone. We just buried him. And you stood there telling my mother to sell our home, while all this time, you were just waiting for him to die." Victoria, ever the strategist, immediately tried to regain control. Her rage vanished, replaced by a mask of wounded fragility. "Daniel, darling, please, I'm emotional. He ambushed me with those horrible illegal recordings. I'm grieving too, in my own way. I didn't mean any of that." But the spell she had woven around him for 15 years was broken. "Didn't you?" Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "My mother worked 2 jobs when I was in high school after Dad's business almost failed. She went without a new coat for 3 winters so I could go to college. She is the reason I have anything. And you? For 15 years, you have been telling me she was selfish, that she was a bad parent, that she was trying to control my life." Each word was a crack in the foundation of their marriage. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the thick emotional atmosphere like a knife. "If I may," he said, looking down at the document in his hands, "there is more to the codicil." Victoria and Daniel fell silent, turning their attention back to the lawyer. I sat perfectly still, feeling Arthur's careful planning wrap around me like a protective cloak. Arthur laid out several conditions for the final distribution of his estate, Mr. Davies read, his tone formal and unwavering. "First, the property at 15 Oakwood Drive, along with all its inheritance, is to be transferred entirely and solely into the name of his wife, Eleanor Peterson, free and I free and clear of any claims." Victoria gasped, a small, choked sound of disbelief. "Second," Mr. Davies continued, not pausing for effect, "the investment portfolio, valued at approximately $800,000, is to be placed into a secure trust for the benefit of his grandchildren, Sophie and Leo Peterson. The sole administrator of this trust, with full discretionary power over its distributions for their education and welfare, will be Eleanor Peterson." That was when Victoria finally lost all control. "No!" she shrieked, jumping from her chair again. "You can't do this! That's our children's money! That money belongs to us!" Mr. Davies simply raised an eyebrow. "It belongs to the trust, which is administered by Eleanor. And there is one final provision." He let his gaze fall on Victoria. "Third, to my daughter-in-law, Victoria Peterson, I bequeath the sum of exactly $1. The insult was so profound it was almost elegant. But Arthur wasn't done. Mr. Davies added, reading directly from the page, "along with an itemized bill to be drafted by my wife for the emotional distress, alienation of affection, and malicious slander caused to her during the final years of my life. This bill is, of course, symbolic." A strange, strangled noise escaped Victoria's lips. Before she could form words, Mr. Davies held up a hand. However, Arthur did provide an alternative, a chance, as he put it, for you to earn a more substantial inheritance. He detailed 5 specific tasks. Victoria would have to personally apologize to me and to the 3 family friends she had systematically alienated over the years. She would have to write a sealed letter of confession to her own children, to be opened on their 18th birthdays, detailing her campaign to isolate them from their grandmother. The third task was a masterpiece of poetic justice. She had to volunteer for 200 hours at a local senior center. And the fourth was the most humiliating of all. During every single one of those hours, she was required to wear a large laminated name tag that read, "Hello, my name is Victoria, and I am learning to respect my elders." Upon verified completion of all 5 tasks, Mr. Davies concluded, she would receive an inheritance of $50,000. It was a sum just large enough to tempt her greed, but the price was her pride. The room was silent. Victoria stood, shaking, her face a storm of fury and humiliation. But it was Daniel's voice that broke the silence. He was no longer looking at his wife with horror or sadness, but with a new, chilling clarity. 15 years, he said softly, shaking his head. For 15 years, you told me I was seeing things, that I was being overly sensitive, that my mother was the problem. He finally looked her straight in the eye. For the first time in our marriage, Victoria, I think I'm seeing exactly who you are. As Daniel stared at his wife, the architect of his profound disillusionment, I spoke for the first time since the recordings began. My voice was quiet but steady, carrying across the silent room. My husband didn't want revenge, Victoria, I said, meeting her wild, hate-filled eyes. He just wanted the truth. He wanted our son to finally hear it in a voice he couldn't deny. My words seemed to snap her back into action. Her panic morphed into a familiar, calculating venom. This is a joke, she spat, turning to Mr. Davies. I'll contest this will. It's obvious Arthur was mentally incompetent, manipulated by her in his final days. No judge in the country will uphold this circus. Mr. Davies didn't flinch. He simply reached into a file and slid 2 documents across the polished desk. Arthur anticipated that claim. These are notarized affidavits from 2 independent neurologists, Dr. Gable and Dr. Marks, certifying his full testamentary capacity, signed 3 days before his passing. He thought of everything. The finality in his tone was absolute. Victoria was trapped. She snatched her purse, her face a mask of pure fury. She jabbed a finger, not at me, but at Daniel. You, she seethed, you can come home and fix this, or you can stay here with her. But you choose carefully, Daniel, because once you side with her, there is no going back. Ever. With that, she stormed out of the office, slamming the door so hard that a painting on the wall shuddered. The next day, Daniel came home. Not for a visit, but with 2 suitcases in his hands. Without a word, he carried them upstairs to his childhood bedroom, the one with the faded baseball posters still on the walls. That evening, I heard his muffled voice from behind the closed door, the cadence sharp and pained. He was on the phone with Victoria. I only caught one clear sentence as I passed in the hallway, a line that was both a confession and an accusation. You made me choose between my wife and my mother for 15 years, Victoria, and I chose wrong every single time. That stops today. 2 days later, Victoria appeared at my front door. The anger was gone, replaced by a practiced, tearful remorse. Eleanor, I am so sorry, she began, her voice catching. I was emotional. I didn't mean any of those things. I looked at her, standing on the porch Arthur had built, and I felt nothing but a vast, weary emptiness. Which things, specifically, didn't you mean, Victoria? I asked calmly. She faltered, thrown by the simple question. All of it, the things on the tape, what I said in the office. I was just so upset. I shook my head slowly. No, Arthur's will wasn't cruel. It was perfectly designed justice. It offered you a path to redemption, a chance to earn back a piece of what you felt you were owed by facing the damage you caused. Her facade began to crack. You call that justice? Humiliating me? Turning my own husband against me? You destroyed our family 15 years ago, Victoria, I said, my voice hardening. You chipped away at my relationship with my son. You erased me from my grandchildren's lives, and you filled my husband's last years with sorrow. Arthur didn't do anything to you. He just made sure everyone could finally see the rubble you created. Her desperation only escalated from there. Daniel, meanwhile, was adrift in a sea of remorse. That night, he sat with me in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I bandaged his scraped knees and celebrated his report cards. God, Mom, I'm so sorry, he whispered, his head in his hands. How did I not see it? How was I so blind for so long? We talked for hours about the missed birthdays, the holidays spent apart, and the grandchildren I barely knew. They're practically strangers to you, he admitted, his voice thick with shame. And that's my fault. Victoria's attempts to regain control grew more frantic. She showed up at Daniel's office, causing a scene in the lobby that got her escorted out by security. The harassing phone calls began, dozens a day, to Daniel's cell and then to the house line, filled with vitriolic threats one moment and desperate pleas the next. Her world was unraveling, and she was determined to drag everyone down with her. Having exhausted threats and false contrition, Victoria resorted to her final, most cruel gambit. She decided to use her children as weapons. A week after she was thrown out of Daniel's office, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, my heart constricted. There on my doorstep stood Sophie, now 12, and Leo, 9, their faces pale and anxious. Victoria stood a few feet behind them on the walkway, her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had coached them, I could see it in their eyes. Sophie, my beautiful granddaughter, whom I barely knew, looked up at me, her lower lip trembling. She recited her line like a reluctant actor in a play she didn't understand. Mommy says you're trying to take Daddy away from us, she said, her voice small. She says you're making him leave because you don't like her. Leo just stared at his shoes, clutching his sister's hand. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, poisoning these innocent children with her lies. I didn't look at Victoria. I knelt, bringing myself down to their level, my own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of theirs. Oh, my sweethearts, I said gently. my voice thick with emotion. That is not true. I love your daddy more than anything, and I love you both so much. This is all very complicated for the grown-ups right now, but none of it is your fault. Never, ever think that. Victoria, seeing her a moment of triumph, stepped forward into the doorway. See what you're doing, Eleanor? She said, her voice dripping with false concern. You're tearing this family apart. She thought she had won. She thought this was her checkmate. But just as she spoke, a car screeched to a halt at the curb. Acting. It was Daniel. He must have been on his way home from work. He took in the scene in an instant, his children standing nervously on my porch, and his wife, a venomous puppet master, standing in my doorway. Victoria, what are you doing here? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet as he strode up the walkway. His face was a thundercloud of anger. I told you to leave my mother alone. She tried to play the victim. I just wanted the children to see their grandmother. Daniel, you're the one who is keeping them away. But Daniel wasn't buying it anymore. You're using them, he said, his voice shaking with rage. You brought them here to be your little messengers, to traumatize them by putting them in the middle of this. Get away from my mother's house. That was it. The final thread of her control snapped. Victoria's mask didn't just slip, she ripped it off and threw it to the ground. This is my life, she shrieked, her voice echoing in the quiet suburban street. My life is being destroyed by your vindictive dead father and your pathetic, clinging mother. I will not let this happen. Daniel stood his ground, his expression hardening into something I had never seen before. Pure, cold resolve. Pack your things, Victoria, he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. I want you out of the house by tonight. She laughed, a high, hysterical sound. You can't throw me out of my own house. I'll see you in court. I'll take everything. He just shook his head. No, you won't. You were so busy managing my inheritance, you forgot to pay attention to our own finances. That house is in my name only. My father advised me to do that years ago. I guess a part of me always knew. Defeated, she stared at him, her eyes burning with a hatred so intense it was frightening. She delivered one final cruel blow, aimed not at me or Daniel, but at her own children. Fine, she spat, but when they're older, they will know what you did. Those children will hate you for breaking up their family. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her car, leaving Sophie and Leo huddled together on my porch, crying. Later that evening, after the children were asleep in their father's old room, the phone rang. It was Mr. Davies. Eleanor, he said, a note of surprise in his voice. I just received a call. It was Victoria. She wants to schedule a meeting. She says she's ready to discuss the terms for completing the tasks. The greed, it seemed, was even stronger than her pride. 6 months later, the house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life again, the sounds I had missed so dearly. The aroma of roasting chicken and rosemary filled the kitchen, and the cheerful chatter of my grandchildren was the sweetest music I had ever heard. Sophie was carefully setting the table, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Leo stood on a stool beside me, enthusiastically stirring the gravy, splashing a little onto the counter with every vigorous turn. Sunday dinner, once a painful memory of what was lost, was now a cherished ritual, a symbol of our family's slow, careful healing. As I watched them, I thought about Victoria and her spectacular failure to claim her $50,000 prize. Her pride, it turned out, was worth more to her than any sum of money. She had attempted Arthur's tasks, but her efforts were a masterclass in self-sabotage. The first task, the personal apologies, ended after just 3 attempts. She complained to Mr. Davies' office that the family friends she had wronged were being unreasonably hostile and refused to accept her half-hearted, blame-shifting apologies. She couldn't grasp that true remorse required humility, a quality she simply did not possess. The letter to her children was an even greater disaster. She submitted 17 different drafts to Mr. Davies for review, as stipulated by the will. Each one was a carefully worded piece of revisionist history, painting her as a misunderstood victim of a controlling mother-in-law. None of them contained a single genuine admission of wrongdoing. Eventually, she gave up, declaring the task emotionally manipulative and impossible. Her stint at the senior center was the most predictable failure. She lasted 6 days. She refused to wear the name tag, claiming it was demeaning, and the center's director received multiple complaints from residents who found her condescending and rude. The therapist Arthur had stipulated she see for the fourth task fared no better. She walked out of their fourth session after the therapist gently suggested she reflect on the patterns in her own behavior. The fifth task, the public apology, was never even attempted. Pride had been her weapon, and in the end, it was her undoing. While Victoria was consumed with these futile efforts, Daniel had quietly and efficiently filed for divorce. The proceedings were swift and uncomplicated. Preoccupied with the perceived injustices of the will, Victoria barely put up a fight for custody, settling for a visitation schedule she rarely adhered to. The children now spent most of their time with Daniel, living in the house their grandfather had built, the house that was now, finally, a home for them too. One afternoon, as Sophie and I were tending to Arthur's roses in the garden, she looked up at me with an expression of quiet wisdom that was far beyond her years. "Grandma," she said, "Mrs. Chen, who used to live next door to us, her daughter is in my class. She told me you used to be friends with my mom. And I heard Mrs. Patterson at the center where Mommy was volunteering. She was talking to another lady and said my mommy was rude to old people." She looked me straight in the eye. "Mommy lied about a lot of things, didn't she? I'm not stupid." In that moment, I knew we would be okay. Daniel and I sat down with both children that night and explained, as gently as we could, their new family dynamic. We told them their mother loved them in her own way, but that she needed some time to figure things out. We explained that now, their family would look a little different. Leo looked worried. "Does that mean fewer people love us now?" he asked, his voice small. I pulled him onto my lap and hugged him tight. "Oh no, my love," I whispered, kissing the top of his head. "It just means you have two homes now, and more people to love you in them. It's not less love. It's more." We began a new tradition that night. We pulled out the old photo albums, the ones filled with pictures of a smiling young Daniel, of holidays and birthdays. We showed them the life they had been kept from, and piece by piece we began to rebuild the family Victoria had tried so hard to tear apart. After we had exhausted the official family albums, I retrieved a different box from the top of my closet. This one was smaller, filled with photos I had never shown anyone. They were grainy, often taken from a distance with a telephoto lens Arthur had bought me. There was Sophie in her first school play, a blurry yellow chick in the back row. There was Leo at his t-ball game, so small in his oversized jersey. And there was Sophie again, in a tiny blue cap and gown for her kindergarten graduation. I had been there for all of it, a ghost in the back of the crowd, my heart aching with a love I wasn't allowed to express. I would watch for an hour, snap a few pictures to prove to myself I hadn't missed it, and then slip away before anyone saw me. Sophie was leaning against my shoulder as we looked through them. She suddenly pointed to the graduation picture. "Wait," she said, her finger tracing a figure standing behind a large oak tree at the edge of the schoolyard. "Is that... Grandma, you were there!" Her voice was filled with a wondering surprise, not accusation. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, and I nodded. "Yes, my love, I was in the back, but I was there. I was always there." She looked from the photo to my face, her young eyes understanding more than I could ever say. She wrapped her arms around my neck and hugged me tightly. "More people who love you doesn't make things confusing," she whispered, echoing Victoria's cruel lie back as a statement of truth. "It just makes things better." In the months that followed, my bond with Daniel was not just healed, it was forged into something stronger than it had ever been. We talked with an honesty that had been missing for 15 years. And my grandchildren, once distant figures in my life, became my joy, my purpose. The house was filled with their sleepovers, their homework spread on the kitchen table, their laughter echoing in halls that had been silent for too long. One afternoon, Mr. Davies called with the final piece of news. "Eleanor," he said, his voice neutral, "I'm informing you that Victoria has formally declined to complete the remaining tasks. She has relinquished any claim to the $50,000. He paused. "She did, however, submit a formal request for her final inheritance payment, the $1. She also informed my office that she wishes for no further contact from you or Daniel outside of the legally required communications regarding her custody rights." I hung up the phone not with triumph, but with a quiet sense of pity. Arthur hadn't built her a prison. He had offered her a key. He gave her a path back, a chance to face her own demons, and perhaps find some peace. But her pride was a fortress she couldn't escape. She had chosen her dollar, a symbol of her bitterness, over a chance at redemption. She had chosen to be alone. A year after Arthur's passing, the house was a symphony of life. It was Sophie's 13th birthday, and the living room was filled with balloons, teenagers, and the chaotic joy of a party. Daniel stood by the fireplace talking with old friends, his smile relaxed and genuine. Leo was in charge of the music, debating the merits of one pop star over another. I stood in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a massive chocolate cake, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. Later that evening, after the last guest had gone and the house was quiet again, I walked into the study. I stood before the portrait of Arthur we'd had painted for our 50th anniversary. He looked out from the canvas with that kind, knowing glint in his eye. "You did it, my love," I whispered to the quiet room. "You kept your promise. You protected us." In that moment, I finally understood. The true inheritance Arthur had left me wasn't the house or the money and the trust. It was the truth. It was the restoration of my dignity. It was the right to love my family, openly and freely, without fear or manipulation. He had left me my son, and he had given me my grandchildren. He had left me everything that truly mattered. The scent of roasting turkey and cinnamon filled the air, a warm, comforting blanket that settled over the entire house. It was our first Thanksgiving as a new family, and the contrast to the previous 15 years was so profound it was almost jarring. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells, no carefully veiled insults hanging in the air. There was only the sound of Leo debating with Daniel about the merits of canned versus fresh cranberry sauce, and Sophie meticulously arranging place cards at the dining room table. For the first time in a long time, the house felt like a home on a holiday, not a stage for a dysfunctional play. The ache of Arthur's absence was still there, a soft, quiet hum beneath the surface, but it was a feeling of loving memory now, not a raw, gaping wound. In the middle of our preparations, Sophie came into the kitchen, her eyes shining with excitement. She held up a permission slip from her school. "Grandma, look! The orchestra has been invited to play in a youth music festival in Vienna this spring. Can I go, please?" My heart swelled with pride for her. Daniel came up behind her and glanced at the form, his brow furrowing slightly at the cost listed at the bottom. The old, familiar anxiety flickered across his face. "Sweetheart, that's a lot of money. We'll have to see." He trailed off, his old habit of deferring to a wife who controlled the finances dying hard. But then he stopped. He looked from the form to me, and his expression softened. A silent understanding passed between us. It was my decision now as the administrator of Arthur's trust. I wiped my hands on my apron and took the form from Sophie, my smile unwavering. "Of course you can go," I said, my voice clear and certain. "This is exactly what the trust is for. It's for your education, your experience, your future. Your grandfather believed the world was the best classroom, and he would be so proud of you." Daniel's shoulders relaxed, a wave of relief washing over him. He put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated trust. It was a small moment, but it was everything. Later, as I was starting on the mashed potatoes, Daniel went up to the attic to find the large silver carving platter we only used on special occasions. He was gone for a long time. When he finally came back downstairs, he wasn't carrying the platter. In his hands, he held a small leather-bound notebook. It was the journal, Arthur's journal. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He wordlessly handed it to me. I already knew what it was, but he opened it to a random page. Arthur's neat, steady script filled the page. "December 25th, V said Sophie was sick, couldn't come." Daniel sounded stressed on the phone, saw a post from V's friend later, pictures from a ski trip. Sophie looked healthy. My heart hurts for Eleanor. Hearing the recordings had been a shock, but seeing the quiet, accumulated pain documented in my husband's own hand was a different kind of heartbreak. It was the story of his silent suffering, endured to protect me and in the vain hope of preserving his relationship with his son. Daniel sank onto a kitchen chair, burying his face in his hands. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out, his voice thick with a fresh wave of guilt. I saw the evidence, but I didn't understand the toll it took on him. Day after day, he just absorbed it all. He never let on how much it was truly hurting him. I sat down beside him and wrapped my arm around his shaking shoulders. He did it so we could have this, Daniel, I said softly. He did it so the truth would have a foundation to stand on when the time was right. The past is a lesson, not a life sentence. The best way you can honor your father is to be happy now, to be the father he knew you could be. That's all he ever wanted. At dinner that evening, surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight, I suggested we start a new tradition. We went around the table, each saying something we were thankful for. Leo, with a mouthful of stuffing, said, "I'm thankful for 2 homes because Grandma lets me have extra dessert." Sophie, now a budding world traveler, said, "I'm thankful for family that supports my dreams." When it was Daniel's turn, he didn't look at his children. He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm thankful for second chances," he said, his voice full of a gratitude so profound it needed no further explanation. And in that moment, looking at the faces of the family I had almost lost, I knew we were finally, truly home. Spring arrived that year not just in the garden, where Arthur's tulips and daffodils burst forth in a riot of color, but in our hearts as well. The day of Sophie's flight to Vienna dawned bright and clear. We all went to the airport to see her off, a happy, bustling caravan of love and support. The sterile, impersonal environment of the terminal felt charged with excitement. This was a milestone, a real, tangible result of our family's healing. As I watched Daniel hoist Sophie's heavy orchestra case onto the luggage scale and Leo double-check her passport for the 10th time, I couldn't help but contrast this moment with all the years I had spent on the periphery, a secret spectator to my own family's life. Now I was not in the back of the crowd. I was at the very center of it, and it felt like coming home. Just before Sophie had to go through security, Mr. Davies had called with one last piece of information. He was closing the file on Arthur's estate and wanted to provide a final update. "Victoria cashed the check, Eleanor," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "The one for $1. We also received a change of address notification. She's moved to a different state, 3 time zones away. It seems she has decided to make a clean break." The news didn't bring me joy or satisfaction, only a quiet, profound sense of closure. It was a famous, lonely ending for her, an exile of her own making. She had traded a family for $1, a future for her pride. At the gate, amidst the final flurry of hugs and last-minute advice, Sophie turned to me. She pressed a small, velvet-wrapped box into my hand. "This is for you, Grandma," she said, her eyes bright. "So you won't be lonely while I'm gone." I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a simple silver locket. I clicked it open and my breath caught in my throat. On one side was a tiny, perfect photograph of Sophie and Leo, their arms around each other. On the other was a picture of a young, smiling Arthur, taken on our honeymoon 53 years ago. The past and the future, resting together in the palm of my hand. "I love you, Grandma," Sophie whispered, giving me one last fierce hug. "Thank you for everything." Daniel put his arm around me as we watched her walk toward the gate, turning to give us one final excited wave. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond this one trip. "For making this happen. For all of it." After her plane had departed, we walked back through the bustling terminal. The noise and crowds faded away, and soon I was back in my own quiet house. But the silence was different now. It was not the crushing, empty silence of grief I had felt in the days after Arthur's funeral. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the warm echoes of a day well spent, brimming with the promise of tomorrow. I sank into Arthur's favorite armchair, the silver locket cool against my skin. I looked out the window at the garden, at the roses just beginning to bud, and I felt my husband's presence as strongly as if he were sitting right beside me. He had orchestrated his final act not as a play for revenge, but as a carefully constructed rescue mission. He had built a fortress of truth to protect us, a foundation of evidence so strong that even 15 years of lies could not stand against it. Victoria had wanted the house, the money, the material possessions. She never understood that those things were just objects. The true inheritance, the one Arthur had so brilliantly secured for us, was this: this peace, this reclaimed love, this beautiful, resilient, imperfect family rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and second chances. He had left us the most valuable estate of all, each other. And in the quiet contentment of my home, surrounded by the evidence of a love that transcended even death, I knew I was the wealthiest woman in the world.